When Marcus Lamb died in November 2021, it sent a shockwave through the Christian world. Daystar viewers mourned him like a fallen general. Pastors across the country posted tributes. Viewers wept in living rooms. To most, Marcus wasn't just a preacher, he was a warrior. A bold, unfiltered voice who stood his ground during COVID-19, challenging government narratives and giving airtime to doctors most networks wouldn't touch. They said his death was sudden. A tragedy. Complications from COVID-19. But not everyone accepted that so easily. Whispers began to move quietly through inner circles. Not from trolls or critics but from people who had been close to the Lamb family for years. People who knew how tight Marcus ran his ship. How calculated everything around Daystar had to be. How little happened without intention. And how something about the way things unfolded after his death just didn't feel right. At the center of those whispers is a woman who has stood beside Marcus for decades. A woman who many thought they knew, Joni Lamb. The faithful wife. The grieving widow. The soft-spoken co-host who seemed shattered by the loss of her husband. But not long after the funeral, something began to shift. And then, quietly, something surfaced, something almost no one outside the family was supposed to ever know about. A private journal. A diary. Hidden in plain sight. And it didn't belong to Marcus. It belonged to Joni. Inside were dated entries, handwritten notes, pages she never meant for anyone else to see. And while no one has come forward with the entire diary, pieces of it, actual scans, have begun to circulate among people close to the network. Quietly. Carefully. Afraid. One person described the contents of those pages as deeply personal, deeply damaging, and impossible to ignore. Because they don't paint the picture of a broken-hearted widow. They paint the picture of a woman conflicted, and possibly already detached. There are mentions, indirect but striking, of marital strain. Notes that point to a growing distance between Marcus and Joni in the final months of his life. Not arguments but silence. Not betrayal but absence. A slow, aching emotional gap. And then a shocking line. A reference to truths Marcus wasn't ready to face. No one can say for certain what that meant. But the timing, the entries leading up to November 2021, have triggered questions that no one at Daystar has been willing to answer publicly. Why was Marcus pushing harder than ever against the system, even as his health was reportedly declining? Why did some staff members later say they hadn't seen Marcus at the studio in weeks before his death, when public broadcasts were making it seem otherwise? And most of all, what exactly was going on between Marcus and Joni in those final weeks? Because what was once dismissed as just grief is now being viewed very differently by those who've seen the diary. One person who viewed the entries described the tone of Joni's writing as detached, almost cold. Not hateful. Just finished. And days after Marcus's death, while the world was still in mourning, those same people say Joni wasn't grieving, she was transitioning. Quietly. Strategically. Into control. In the days following Marcus Lamb's death, there was a wave of sorrow that swept across Daystar. But behind the public memorials and soft piano tributes, people inside the building began noticing something strange. The tone changed fast. Not just grief, but redirection. And it started with Joni. According to two former Daystar staffers who have since quietly stepped away from the network, something shifted immediately after the funeral. One described it like this. It was almost like she had already accepted it before it happened. Like she wasn't surprised. Joni didn't disappear into mourning. She stepped straight into the spotlight, sharper, more decisive, and strangely energized. Meetings were held. Department heads were shifted. Projects Marcus had put on pause were suddenly back on the table. And most notably, new faces started showing up behind closed doors. One of them was Dr. Doug Weiss. At first, no one said anything. Doug was a longtime friend of the network, a familiar face in the Christian counseling world. But he wasn't just stopping by. He was sitting in on meetings, consulting, advising. Even before his relationship with Joni was made public, some staff members say they knew something was going on. It wasn't just professional. It felt intimate, personal. And for those who had worked closely with Marcus, the timing felt off. Way off. Marcus hadn't been gone a month before changes started rolling out across Daystar's structure. People who had been close to him, long-serving loyal staff, were quietly pushed out, reassigned, or cut off completely. When some asked questions, they were told to trust leadership. When others brought up concerns about Joni's new tone, they were told, she's grieving in her own way. But behind closed doors, the word grief didn't seem to match the mood. Joni wasn't crying. She was moving. Making decisions. Recasting the vision of the network. Some said it felt like she had a plan already waiting. And more than one person who was there during that transition now believes she had known Marcus was going to die. That's not to say she wanted it. But it is to say she wasn't caught off guard. Not emotionally. Not financially. Not logistically. And that's where the diary becomes chilling. Because one of the most jarring entries, one that multiple sources claim to have seen, was written just days before Marcus was hospitalized. Read. Everything is coming into view now. I just have to stay quiet. Let it unfold. God sees. To someone outside the circle that might sound harmless, spiritual, reflective. But to those who saw the context, who knew what was going on in the home, what had been happening between Marcus and Joni behind the cameras, it read more like a signal. Like someone waiting for something to end. Like someone who had already emotionally moved on. And then there was the estate. Almost immediately after Marcus's death, legal documents began circulating, changing ownership, restructuring leadership, signing control of key assets into Joni's name. Quickly. Efficient. As if nothing had ever been uncertain. The question isn't whether Joni was allowed to grieve how she wanted. The question is, why does it seem like she didn't need to grieve at all? And what did Marcus know before he took his last breath? Marcus Lamb didn't get a chance to speak his truth. Whether he planned to confront Joni, or simply walk away quietly, we may never know. But what's clear now is that something was unraveling long before he died, not just in his body but in his home. The diary points to a woman already emotionally gone. The network's transition points to a plan already in motion. And the silence surrounding it all? That speaks louder than words. Joni Lamb has never addressed the rumors. She never explained the diary. She never explained how she moved so quickly, from widow to CEO, from grieving to engaged. But the people who were there saw it. And they haven't forgotten. Because maybe the most painful part of Marcus Lamb's story isn't how he died. It's what was happening while he was still alive.